During the colonial era, many ethnic groups within Nigeria were forced to accept British values. This resulted in indigenous cultures and customs being marginalised in favour of Western ones. And one of the cultural practices that fell victim to this process were tribal marks. Hello. So a while back I wrote an essay called Marked, inspired by a documentary film by Nadine Ibrahim also called Marked, and generally it explored scarification within Nigeria, particularly within the Yoruba tribe. And that's exactly what we're going to discuss today. In many different African societies, tribal marks and more broadly scarification have held a lot of significance, symbolising identity, spirituality, beauty and identification. In Nigeria, these marks vary across different tribal and ethnic groups, with each design carrying its own distinct meaning. However, these practices are under scrutiny. The Nigerian Child Rights Act of 2003 makes it illegal to inflict any ethnic or ritual cuts on the skin which leaves permanent marks, with violators facing a fine of 5,000 naira, imprisonment or both. So this legislation reflects the growing tension between tradition and customs and human rights standards, and it highlights the complexities of preserving cultural identity and also navigating an increasingly globalized world.
Nigeria has moved to outlaw the practice, but many states have yet to approve the law. Still, facial scars are becoming harder to find, as many parents are influenced by the West.
Might I mention as well that during the colonial era, the Christian missionaries brought around the act of erasure. This system of erasure sought to curtail ethnic behaviours, their traditions, their customs. They were very much labelled as heathen and barbaric. Of course, this practice isn't limited to Christianity. The widespread influence of Islam, similar sentiments were shared. This was also captured in an academic paper that stated, "The hegemonic spread of Western-centric values, norms and behaviours has significantly displaced the indigenous standpoint, inverting what was once largely seen as a symbol of pride and positive identity into a source of detriment, shame and rejection." Which is very true. We know that a lot of traditional customs are often labelled very negatively. They're often assessed in a religious lens, be that Christianity or Islam, and if they're seen to go against that, they're seen as, ungodly. For example, I know tattoos aren't taken very well in Nigerian society. I know the attitude is changing with the younger generation, but for the older generation that are very much still here, it's kind of seen as a form of delinquency. But my grandmother had a lot of tattoos. I'm not too sure what the Yoruba name is, but it's kind of like lali, so it's almost like a permanent type of henna. She had them on the arms and the legs, and one of the first missionaries to visit Yoruba land, named Clapperton, he met the Alaafin of Oyo at that time, so the King of Oyo. And in describing his appearance, he stated, "The monarch was richly dressed in the scarlet damask robe, ornamented with coral beads and short trousers of the same colour, with a light blue stripe made of country cloth. His legs, as far as the knees, were stained with red henna." I think it is quite interesting to read that the Alaafin had henna on his legs, and from that account it does sound like he had quite a lot, so it's quite obvious that body art was a thing. It's very possible that stayed on his skin permanently.
Yeah, so what does this mean? Is this a lizard?
Yes, it's a lizard. This is lizard.
And what does it mean when it's on the stomach like that?
It does not mean anything, it's just for fashion.
So tribal marks in Yoruba culture. I often hear when people are discussing tribal marks that it came about as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. That's incorrect. Within the Yoruba ethnic group, tribal marks for a very, very long time, thousands of years, has served multiple purposes. One of the main ones is identification. The different marks, which is also known as Ila in Yoruba, they help identify people from different tribal and ethnic groups. Olanike, in a research paper, described that the Yorubas are actually born into a patrilineal clan known as Idile Baba. In English, that's essentially father's house. Clan members are descendants of the same ancestors. They share certain similarities such as orikis, taboos, and of course tribal marks. Some commentators have described tribal marks as a form of history on the move within an indigenous knowledge system. They're very much that bearers passport. And they are typically inscribed on an infant as young as 3 weeks old. It's done at such a young age because it's believed that the skin is very supple and soft, so it'll be easy to mark and also heal. Again, regarding identification purposes, if you're well versed in Yoruba culture, by looking at someone with tribal marks, you should be able to discern where they're from. They are unique to particular tribal groups. I'm not too sure how many people are able to do that nowadays. It's also said that these marks provided identification during intertribal wars. This is because agreements existed between different Obas to protect certain individuals from enslavement. So if you didn't know, the Yorubas engaged a lot in war. We had various different kingdoms and they all had their own respective Obas, and as a result of these wars, it was really common for Yorubas to enslave one another. Ibadan, the city that my father is from, was historically a military-based town, which formed part of the Oyo kingdom. So the Yorubas enslaved one another a lot. It helped strengthen and expand their kingdoms. I honestly have to stress, the enslavement that went on then is very different from the type of slavery that we saw in the transatlantic slave trade. They are not like for like. Slaves were part and parcel of Yoruba society. They were very much integrated. We have a lot of proverbs which make mention of them as well. For example, we say Ofintaba tori erushi tori omodanu, which translates as a law that we make, a law or rule that we make because of a slave, we can't now because of a freeborn decide to turn it back. So basically, we can't be hypocritical or have a double standard. One rule applies to all. But while it is the case that it existed for millennia prior to the transatlantic slave trade, it did serve as a source of identification in the diaspora during that era as well. Very interestingly, during my research, I found that tribal marks became increasingly popular in Nigeria during the Civil War.
Because of the position in the field, it can be said with confidence that victory is in sight. I therefore urge all the citizens of this country to remain vigilant and resolved. God is with us. God will see us through. Long live one Nigeria.
It's claimed that some Yorubas were saved because they had tribal marks. Those who didn't were killed because they were actually mistaken for Southeasterners, which is interesting in the sense that sometimes you can tell, I would say a lot of the time, I feel like I can tell different ethnic groups. Sometimes I can tell if someone is Yoruba or Igbo or maybe even Hausa. I do feel like we do have certain features which are typically Yoruba or Igbo, but sometimes there is just that ambiguity. Moving on from identification, tribal marks are also used for beautification. They also have spiritual purposes. The Yoruba spiritual system is very vast, but we will take one example. Children who are believed to be Abiku children. These are children that are thought to be repeatedly born onto the same mother, but then they die in the early stages of infancy. So for example, they are born, they're around for a little bit, they die, mother gets pregnant, gives birth, baby dies, and the cycle continues. I don't know if I explained that really badly. Anyway, marks are given to these children to basically make them stay on earth. It's believed that once they are marked, their spiritual clan rejects them and doesn't take them back, so they're basically bound on earth. Marks for Abiku children include a single horizontal or vertical line on the cheek. One thing I've realized in my work is that I cannot talk about Nigerian issues and Nigerian society without touching on colonialism. It's very clear to me that they can't even be divorced. Even in my Aishaayanx discourse and my essay, colonialism is so key. So as I stated earlier, colonialism brought about a system of erasure. Anything African could see its way out. Word to Wizkid, I'm not Afro anything, bitch. So during that era, cultural imperialism took place, and we also see iconoclasm. What is iconoclasm? That was the deliberate destruction of cultural shrines, sacred items, artifacts, any kind of cultural and spiritual material and traditional. It was destroyed. Missionaries labelled them as pagan and therefore barbaric, and also Yorubas who converted to Christianity, who adopted that belief, they also contributed to that destruction. Bad things were happening, I tell you. But not only did the missionaries and by extension colonialism demonize native practices and tradition, they also imposed the Western standard of beauty and respectability. Through this, Africans were taught how to assimilate to Western standards in order to be considered, palatable. Colonial administrators saw the act of scarification as bodily disfigurement and also a form of barbarism and just generally non-Christian. And it led to the belief that scarification was unattractive, it was regressive, and it was also backwards. And this viewpoint hasn't changed. The Act of 2003, which criminalises scarification, quite clearly highlights that we are moving away from this, and it also doesn't have a place in our society, and it's also incompatible with human rights. We know how big Nigeria is on human rights. I do want to assess this in another lens. Now, of course, some critics may view this law as incredibly harsh and quite draconian. I do believe that there is a bigger picture here that is worth analysis, and that's of course older customs being marginalised in favour of more Eurocentric ideals and standards of modernity. It was said in one paper that the enforcers of this new normality are not just colonial actors, but also indigenous Nigerians who have internalised colonial norms. Now, I guess you're thinking, what are you talking about? This is about children, this is about children's rights and, protecting them. And therefore the law is perfectly fine. Indeed, I do not disagree with that. I believe it's absolutely imperative to protect children. But I think when you look at this matter through the lens of neocolonialism, it does start to get a bit interesting, and it does warrant a lot more critical examination beyond the scope of autonomy and human rights. So when assessed through neocolonialism, the stigma around scarification can be seen as the loss of cultural autonomy under the guise of progressiveness, particularly when we apply it to beauty and appearances. So is this really about moving forward? Is this really about autonomy? Or is it another way to erase indigenous appearances and attributes in favour of more Western standards of modernity? I remember discussing the issue of tribal marks on TikTok, and some commentators raised the issue of circumcision, basically along the lines of, why do parents get to circumcise their children? That's permanent. Why is that allowed but tribal marks aren't? Feel free to discuss that in the comments. So in challenging the notion that restricting scarifications are progressive, it was articulated that to the extent that culture can be viewed as software that programs the mind, what we have uncovered in the course of our research is a case of Western and particularly British values, norms and mores that have largely reprogrammed a mass population, altering its historical definitions of beauty, attractiveness and social status, and turning it against itself. The displacement of indigenous standards of beauty should not be viewed as a derivative of progress or the erasure of primitive backwardness. In other words, the stigmatization of tribal marks is not a symptom of economic modernization. I do think that quote provides us with quite a lot to think about in this context. How does the adoption of Western and British values make us see ourselves as Africans? Point blank, tribal marks in Nigeria bear a lot of stigma, particularly in your urban cities like Lagos. They are seen to be almost a sign of unattractiveness rather than pride or heritage, which arguably is a clear subversion of beauty standards. And even the 2003 Child Rights Act can also be seen as systemically creating stigma around the practice. I make no comment on whether that's right or wrong. For many bearers of scarification, the consequences are heavy. Many report a profound sense of shame, diminished self-worth, instances of discrimination, socially, at work, and also in romantic pursuits. A study found that members of Nigeria's Yoruba tribe bearing the stigma of tribal marks struggle to find and maintain gainful employment in the labour market. A research paper by Toyin Ajisa and others explored and analysed the impact of having tribal marks in corporate Nigeria. And from what they found, for many it is indeed a battlefield. There's a lot of discrimination, emotional pain. Many reported that they have anxiety, they frequently experience mockery as well. This could be by colleagues and also clients. Here are some participants' experiences. It is very depressing and demeaning when your colleagues mock you and your manager treats you differently because you have tribal marks, said Tolani. Raphael, 39, bank manager, revealed that it may have been fashionable and acceptable in the past, but certainly not in today's Nigeria. I think I do not look right to people. It has destroyed my self-image and filled me with huge self-hatred and self-disgust. It is psychological torture for me. Pauline, a lawyer, said that I have been rejected by clients because of my marks. They think I'm inept because I have tribal marks, so they ask the firm for a lawyer without tribal marks. I remember trying to persuade a client that my tribal marks have nothing to do with my ability and professionalism, but she wouldn't listen. In my essay, I do argue that these difficulties, however, stem not from the act of scarification per se, but the societal attitudes that marginalise them. Further to my point, these studies also reveal that these negative experiences tend to be more prevalent in urban settings. Of course, this is where beauty standards tend to align more with Western ideas. In contrast, rural societies exhibit greater acceptance and reverence for more indigenous forms of identity and beauty. Adisa also noted, social stigma is thus a sociological phenomenon in which dominant colonial culture frames coerces conformity to the central narrative and simultaneously erase and replace the marginalised other. The former displaces the latter, imposing its definition of what it means to be normal. Indeed, its criminalisation and social stigma reflect the legacy of colonialism, and it continuously shows up in society. It encourages narratives where indigenous customs are sidelined in favour of Western and global norms. And there is a double standard here. Tattooing is seen as socially acceptable, it's seen as attractive, it's seen as sexy. The New Zealanders who get the tattoos done, that's celebrated, that's documented, that's not seen in the lens of disgust. The Yakuza in Japan, their tattoos are also very glamorized. Aishaayanx recently went to get a bunch of face tattoos, which leaves very much to be desired, in my opinion, of course. I thought it was a joke at first, but then I saw the video of him at the Grammys and I was like, oh my god. But as a Yoruba, he could have got tribal marks. But I think my point is, it's interesting how we determine what is socially acceptable, socially attractive. Why do we pick this over that? And what influences our decision making? The thing is with Aishaayanx's face tattoos is that people are either here for it or they're not. But I really believe that if he had gotten tribal marks, the reception wouldn't be positive at all. In my frank and honest opinion, I truly believe that people hate things that are indigenously African. Unless it's on the global stage and accepted as cool, just forget about it. It has to go through the Western process of legitimacy before it's accepted. Even, and I do not think this is a reach, even when we think about the trend in terms of cultural clothing, we have gone astray when it comes to how we do cultural wear. I will discuss this a lot more in my Aishaayanx series. However, apart from using culturally relevant materials such as ashulki and lace and whatever, are we even wearing native clothes anymore? Where is the Urati buba? Instead it's a corset top and a very long train, which, where does that even come from? It's just a gown. And I'm not saying this because I dislike it, but it is just an observation. When I've discussed the evolution of Aishaayanx on TikTok, I had some commentators with dissenting arguments saying, oh, fashion evolves. Yeah, it does. I digress. Final thoughts. In one of my previous essays, I wrote, cultural practices are fluid. Their survival and relevance depends on their ability to enhance community life. When they stop fulfilling that purpose, they naturally fade out. The practice of scarification raises some difficult questions. Should this tradition be phased out? After all, something being tradition does not justify its continuation. This issue of tribal marks highlights the clash between cultural identities, beauty politics, and globalization. But here's my view. I don't think the act of scarification is inherently bad, but contemporary society makes it hard for it to exist. As I mentioned, in terms of it being for identification purposes, almost like a passport. Because of modernization, we don't need a passport on one's face anymore. We now have identification in digital and paper form. Most importantly, young children and babies are marked without their consent. They are marked for life. I believe it's unethical to do so nowadays, and I also believe that it's really not fair. The social and economic hardships that people with tribal marks go through in Nigerian society would suggest that it would be more beneficial to move away from this practice. And I say this not to diminish its cultural importance, but rather from a standpoint that understands the world that seeks to ostracize it. There are some Nigerian creators who have gained some prominence due to their tribal marks. They've done a few interviews. I would definitely recommend checking them out on social media. But that would be all from me. This topic was very dear to me, so thank you so much for watching, and please let me know your thoughts in the comments as always. And I will see you next time. was a time last year when I was in Ibadan and I was standing outside the building with my dad, and a man was walking past and he had tribal marks, and for some reason he caught my eye. I said to my dad, do you know where he's from? I don't remember, maybe he told me or maybe he didn't, but I do remember the fact that he said, you know what, when he comes round I will call him for you. And indeed he did call this gentleman, and he asked him where he's from, and he did explain his heritage and he's Idile Baba. It was nice to, you know, hear someone kind of recount their heritage. Yeah, history on the move.